Have you ever thought to yourself, I really need like an hour and a half plus long video of RGT going over hidden gems for various systems? Well, if so, you're in luck because that's what today's video is. Obviously, this is a compilation of my hidden gems videos from years ago. Some of them are actually a little bit newer than others, but I feel like a lot of these videos missed out on people because, well, you might not have been here for it. I hope you guys enjoy this. I'm kind of nervous about uploading such a long video. We look at some different Nintendo and Sega systems. At the end, there is a smorgasbord of 11 underrated games that I forgot I even made that video. So be sure to like it, be sure to share it, and I hope you guys enjoy this sort of compilation. And who knows, if this video does well, I'll do more compilations and maybe even some more hidden gems videos in the future. But for now, enjoy.
The NES, in my opinion, is one of the greatest consoles of all time. It was the first console I had as a kid, so I've been playing some of these games for nearly 26 plus years. And that's a long time to be playing the same games. But there's such a great variety in the library, and there's so many titles to choose from. You've got awesome games like Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3, Double Dragon, Ninja Gaiden, Battletoads, Final Fantasy, The Legend of Zelda. The list goes on and on with timeless classics from the NES library. Now, a lot of people seem to think that they know all of the best games on the system and they've played everything worth playing. But I don't think that's necessarily true. There's a lot of under the radar games that either people just overlook or don't know about. So in this video, we're going to take a look at my NES hidden gems. These are games that I think don't get enough coverage, games that are definitely worth playing, and games that you should definitely own. Now, without any further ado, let's check out my list of NES hidden gems.
A Nightmare on Elm Street is a game that gets a bad reputation, but I'm not quite sure why, honestly. Following the theme of the movies, up to 4 players can try and take down Freddy all at the same time, which makes this game very unique on the NES. Players must stay awake by defeating enemies, avoiding getting hit, and picking up coffee. When in the dream world, you'll battle various versions of Freddy as well, all inspired by the movies. The platforming is decent, and the music is very well composed as well, which makes A Nightmare on Elm Street a solid addition to the NES library and a true hidden gem in my opinion. Felix the Cat is the most expensive game on this list, but I think it's one of the best games on the NES that not enough people seem to talk about. Felix the Cat is a 2D platformer from Hudson Soft, with bright and colorful graphics and really tight gameplay. Felix also has a bunch of different attacks with power-ups from his magic that enhance the gameplay experience immensely. At the time of this video, Felix is about $70 for a loose cart, due to being a late release on the NES, and I foresee this title becoming even more expensive in the future. Felix the Cat is a fantastic game on the NES and definitely should be in your NES library. Rescue the Embassy Mission is a game that you often see for single digits, and you might pass it up thinking it's a garbage title because of the price. In actuality though, Rescue the Embassy Mission plays a lot like Rainbow Six games that were very popular in the early 2000s. The gameplay variety is pretty impressive for this game, featuring sneaking missions, sniping, and infiltration of a building to rescue hostages inside. The animation is pretty solid for the time, and the gameplay is pretty fun as well. The game can be completed pretty quickly, but that shouldn't deter you from picking up this game because there is a lot of fun to be had with Rescue the Embassy Mission. Pro wrestling games are often thought to be hollow and meaningless experiences on the NES, but if you're looking for a decent one, Tecmo World Wrestling will more than fill that role. With 20 moves per wrestler, there's a good amount of variety for grappling fans to enjoy with this game. A neat addition is the text-based announcer calling the action on the lower portion of the screen, which really adds a layer of depth to the game. Tecmo World Wrestling is another cheap NES title that you probably often overlook, but it's a real hidden gem for the console, and I recommend picking it up. Violent games aren't something you think of when you think of the NES library, so it doesn't seem like a franchise like The Punisher would work on the console. But guess what? It does. Playing as the Punisher, you move on rails, mowing down Kingpin's med in gritty urban environments. The Punisher features some really nice graphics and level design, and the shooting mechanics are pretty fluid as well. The game features a wide variety of power-ups such as a bazooka and a machine gun to keep things fresh throughout. If you enjoy rail shooters or comic book franchises, The Punisher is a very solid addition to your NES library. Archon was a game I wasn't familiar with until about 2 years ago, but I'm glad I found this game, as it's one of the most hidden gems on the NES. On the surface, Archon looks like a strange game of chess, but there's so much more to the game. You try and control power points on the map and eliminate your opposition, but when you battle, it's in real time. Each character has strengths and weaknesses, so matchups are key when battling. Certain characters can move more freely than others, like in chess as well, so you have to be really careful not to leave your team open to attack. What I really enjoy about this game is that even if a higher ranked character attacks your lower rank, you still have a fighting chance since the battling is done in real time. Archon takes a little bit to get used to, but once you understand the mechanics of the game, it's a ton of fun. Everyone talks about Batman from Sunsoft as one of the finest NES entries, but I think Batman Returns deserves some recognition as well. Less Ninja Gaiden and more Double Dragon, Batman Returns is a beat 'em up that feels a lot like a traditional Batman experience that we're used to today. Batman Returns follows the events of the movies with locations and enemies from the hit film well represented in the game. As with any game in the genre, it can be a bit monotonous at times, but Batman Returns is a fun beat 'em up that 8-bit enthusiasts will have a lot of fun with. The Guardian Legend is probably the most well-known game on this list, but it's still a hidden gem in the fact that most people don't realize how impactful this game was. Receiving mixed reviews and low fanfare when originally released on the NES, The Guardian Legend is a blend of a vertical shoot 'em up and a top-down action game that feels a bit like The Legend of Zelda. The shoot 'em up portions of the game are fast and frantic, and control really well with some impressive graphics. The top-down action portions also feel good as well, with a non-linear exploration system while searching through the area known as the Labyrinth. With some of the best graphics on the NES, The Guardian Legend is an excellent adventure, and if you haven't picked it up yet, it's still a very affordable NES hidden gem. Crystalis is an action RPG for the NES that plays a lot like The Legend of Zelda, but with an improved level of visual fidelity. Playing as a man who awakes from a cryogenic sleep 100 years after a nuclear war, your quest is to save humanity. You travel throughout the land in dungeons leveling up, defeating monsters, and collecting swords which can upgrade your attacks. The game has a strong emphasis on leveling up, with some enemies and bosses not being able to be defeated until you are a certain level. With an excellent soundtrack and fun gameplay, Crystalis is a must-have for action RPG fans looking for a high-quality experience on the NES.
So there you have it. Those are my NES hidden gems. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, you missed this game, you missed that game, why didn't you talk about this game? And honestly, I like to leave these lists open to interpretation. I also leave things off of these lists as well. Why do I do that? Because I plan on doing sequels to these, like my N64 one and my Dreamcast one. You see, I haven't played every N64 game, I haven't played every Dreamcast game, and I certainly haven't played every NES game. So for these videos, sometimes I leave off games I'm not super familiar with until I get familiar with them, so I can do a part 2 of these lists, because there's always going to be hidden gems, there's always going to be undiscovered games that maybe I don't know about today, but in 2 weeks could end up being one of my favorite games of all time. Now, I know Felix the Cat is one of the more expensive games on the list, but I do like to include one pricey game that is still very high in quality. I do that with all of my Hidden Gems videos. You'll never see something like Little Samson on these though. Even though Little Samson is a good game, it's way overpriced. So I'm never going to hit you with games that are triple digits plus, because I don't think that's fair to collectors. So hopefully you enjoyed this list. Hopefully you learned about some new games that maybe you weren't familiar with. Now, if you have any suggestions for future Hidden Gems videos, leave it in the comments section below. Let me know what games you would like to see on NES Hidden Gems Part 2. And of course, let me know what you thought about the list as it is. I'm RGT85. Thank you for liking this video. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. And I will see you guys next time. Later. So one of my favorite game consoles of all time is the N64. Coming off the Sega Genesis, the N64 was the next system I got, and it was just mind-blowing with games like Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Mario Kart 64. This thing was just a powerhouse, and to see all these polygons and 3D sort of open worlds was just an amazing experience for me at the time. The N64 also brought about 4-player compatibility, which made games like GoldenEye 007 and WWF No Mercy timeless classics because 4 players could play at once, which quickly became the industry standard. But for all the good the N64 had, there was a few drawbacks, and a couple of them actually affected games. You see, the N64 used cartridges, and the industry was moving towards CDs at this time, so it kind of affected the N64's library. If you compare the PlayStation 1's library to the N64's, it's a fraction of what the PlayStation 1 got. So you would think that with all the N64 games that came out, it would be hard to kind of find hidden gems in the library because everyone kind of knows about all the games. But I think there's some games that aren't talked about enough. I think there's some games that flew under the radar, or maybe just some games where you look at it and you're like, it's not for me, but you should actually pick them up. So in this video, we're going to look at some N64 hidden gems. Let's see what I got for you guys.
The N64 was full of racing games, with Mario Kart 64 and Diddy Kong Racing being the two most popular ones that come to mind. Rare actually made another racing game though, Mickey Speedway USA, and it's pretty damn good. A kart racer similar to Mario Kart, but with the gameplay mechanics and styling like Diddy Kong Racing, Mickey Speedway USA was a fun and satisfying racers for those who had played the hell out of Diddy Kong and Mario Kart. Although the character selection was a bit lacking, Mickey Speedway USA is a solid racer that N64 owners should check out. The Strike series was a trilogy on the Super Nintendo and Genesis, but the N64 actually saw a version with Nuclear Strike 64. Nuclear Strike 64 plays kind of like a badass action movie, with a heavy emphasis on blowing things up from a variety of aircraft. The N64 version uses the expansion pack, which allows for higher resolution textures, and the game even features some voice speech, which is a bit of a rarity for the cartridge-based console. If you like a ton of action and blowing stuff up, Nuclear Strike 64 is a game to keep an eye out for. Speaking of a ton of action and blowing stuff up, Blast Corps was another gem on the N64 that not enough people talk about. Another Rare developed game, Blast Corps was unique in the fact that destruction is not just encouraged, but necessary in order to stop a nuke from blowing things up. Because I guess destroying things will stop that nuke from blowing up more things. Silly plot aside, Blast Corps has a ton of vehicles at your disposal, each with unique abilities. Blast Corps is one of the most unique games of all time and is definitely worth checking out. Fighting games may have been a bit limited on the N64, but one of the best ones is one that nobody talks about, Flying Dragon. Arcades were heating up with 3D fighters being a hot topic, but 2D fighters were still a mainstay with games like Street Fighter. Flying Dragon did what no other game has done, even to this day though. Not only was the game a 2D fighter with story mode and level progression, but also had a 3D fighting mode as well, and actually had some different characters than the 2D mode did. Characters that were in the 2D mode that made the jump to the 3D mode were redone visually as well. While not the best fighting game ever, the uniqueness of having two distinct fighting styles on one cartridge makes Flying Dragon a true hidden gem for the N64. The PS1 had an amazing game called Metal Gear Solid, and a game called WinBack was released on the N64 that many at the time of the release considered to be a poor man's Metal Gear. In actuality, in retrospect though, WinBack was actually a very solid game that introduced a mechanic that has become a staple in modern gaming: cover-based shooting. WinBack may look and play a little bit dated, but the gameplay mechanics make it a worthwhile game to check out on the N64. The N64 was home to a ton of platformer games, with highlights including Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. Chameleon Twist is a lesser known platformer for the N64, but is a pretty solid game in its own right. Chameleon Twist uses an interesting mechanic, using a tongue to get around from place to place and attack enemies. The game is a bit on the short side, and some of the textures are pretty low resolution, but Chameleon Twist is a cheap and welcome addition to N64 platform lovers' libraries. Treasure is one of the most beloved developers of all time, with the amazing Gunstar Heroes on the Genesis, and Treasure created an amazing 2D platformer on the N64, Mischief Makers. A highly stylized 2D action platformer, Mischief Makers oozes a charm and style that was just unmatched at the time. With a ton of levels and gameplay variations ranging from action-based to some levels being puzzle-based, Mischief Makers has the charm, styling, and solid gameplay mechanics that make it a true hidden gem on the N64. Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine is a game I did a full review on, but before getting into the last hidden gem, I did want to mention it just briefly. Not only a hidden gem, Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine is one of the best games on the N64, period. Check out my full review of it to get all the details. The final hidden gem is a precursor to Grand Theft Auto 3. No, seriously, the team that developed the game went on to form Rockstar Games, and the early influences of Grand Theft Auto 3 can actually be seen in this game, Body Harvest. Body Harvest plays out like a 60s sci-fi movie and has you placed in open world settings to stop an alien invasion. The player has the ability to enter any building, go anywhere, and drive any vehicle that is found. With lots of secrets, fun, alien blasting gameplay, Body Harvest is one of my favorite games on the N64 and definitely deserves to be more well known.
And that is a look at some N64 hidden gems. There's a lot more hidden gems on the system too, but these are the ones that kind of just stuck out to me. I'm not saying these are perfect games or excellent games, but they're fun, they can be acquired for a pretty low price on most of them, and they're definitely games you should check out if you're an N64 fan and you like the system. So let me know in the comment section below if I missed any games in your opinion, and maybe I'll do a follow-up video to this one day as well. Thank you for checking this video out. Make sure you like it. Leave me your comments down below if you've played any of these games and what you think about them, or if you plan to pick them up, and I'll see you guys next time. Later.
Everyone seems to be talking about the GameCube again nowadays, because you got people that are like belittling your intelligence and like, this is how you take a GameCube game out on these YouTube shorts, and they're blowing up. And I don't know why. Screw you, John. Screw you. But on a serious note, the GameCube is a system that I definitely really enjoy. I prefer the N64 a little bit more than the GameCube, but that doesn't mean that the GameCube isn't a great system, because there's a ton of great games on the system. Now, hidden gems lists are getting harder and harder to do because everyone seems to know about every game, but there's some games that I feel like nobody ever talks about on the GameCube, even in the current age of the renaissance of the GameCube, so I want to be the one to talk about these games. Now, there's a couple things I want to talk about before we go into the list. Some games I'm excluding on purpose because I haven't played them before. A game like Odama or Billy Hatcher, those are on a lot of people's hidden gems list. I've never played those games before, so I'm not going to talk about them. And some games I feel they're not hidden gems, but they always seem to come up on hidden gems lists, such as, you know, your stuff like Tales of Symphonia. I'm not talking about Bats and Kaitos. I'm not talking about all that stuff. I'm trying to talk about some deeper cuts of the GameCube library and the video game landscape at that time. So with that being said, let's talk about some GameCube hidden gems. Just emulate all these games. I don't want to hear any crying about game prices. You're driving up the game price. No, I'm not, because I'm telling you to emulate this. I'm not telling you to buy any single one of these games. There's a million different emulators out there, a million different devices you can do it with, so don't cry to me about it. But let's talk about some GameCube games now. The first game we're going to talk about is a game that is available on other platforms as well. You can actually buy it on Steam currently, but I always assimilate it with the GameCube because that's where I played this title, and that is a game called Second Sight. Now, Second Sight should have been a more popular game. The problem was there was a game that came out on PlayStation 2 and Xbox that was kind of similar called Psyops that got all the attention that used sort of a similar gameplay mechanic. But for me personally, I like the story in Second Sight a lot more. You're basically an old soldier who has forgotten a bunch of stuff, and he's in like some weird little chamber thing, government, and you get flashbacks and you go back to the past and do things that you did within the past. You're trying to figure out what is going on, trying to regain your memory. But the cool thing about this game is the combat in the game, or kind of the lack thereof. It's sort of a combat driven but also a stealth driven game, and you get psychic abilities that you end up leveling up that become stronger, and you get more different abilities as you progress through the game. It's a really fun game. It's a game that I have thoroughly enjoyed. It's something that whenever anyone asks me about an under the radar game for the Nintendo GameCube, I always bring up Second Sight because yes, it is a multi-platform release. You can get this on other platforms, but the problem is nobody bought this on any platform. So it doesn't matter what you assimilate this game with because it is a fun game. It still looks pretty good. The voice acting is a little bit shoddy, but I think the overall experience that you get with Second Sight is a fantastic experience. It's a game that I loved back in the day. I still like to play it from time to time now, and Second Sight is definitely a game that's held up very well. So if you haven't checked out Second Sight, make sure you check it out on your Nintendo GameCube or on something else. Sticking with the paranormal sort of stuff, we're going to talk about the next game on my list, which is Geist. Yes, Geist is a good game. I thought Geist was a good game back in the day. When it first came out, I bought it, I enjoyed it. I didn't understand why a lot of people didn't like it. I thought people maybe didn't like it because of the fact that there was no online multiplayer, and that was kind of the big thing in first-person shooters. It did have local multiplayer, but there was no online multiplayer. But people seem to absolutely hate this game, and I don't know why. Once again, voice acting sucks. It's not good voice acting, but the game itself is freaking awesome. After the intro cutscene, you die. That's it. You're done. Game over. Or is it? Because now you become a Geist, which is a paranormal entity, and you can basically take control of pretty much a ton of stuff within the levels. You can control a rat and like scare a guard. You can control an alarm and scare a guard. Once you scare the guard, then you could become the guard and have his gun and have his abilities. Like, the whole premise is absolutely fascinating. It's so freaking cool to figure out how many different ways you could become different things or different characters or different inanimate objects within this game in order to advance through the game and get to the ending. I think the story is decent enough. It's kind of like a between the realms sort of thing because you're dead. You die very early in the game, but I thoroughly enjoy Geist. It's not really a looker. You know, the graphics on the game aren't that great, and they weren't that great for the time frame. That was one of the main things that this game got knocked down on. But people looked at the graphics of Geist and then just wrote off the entire game without actually playing it. And when you actually play it, the gameplay is just top notch. I wish they would make another Geist game. Honestly, I wish they would at least HD remaster the original Geist because it was so different, it was so fresh, and it was so unique. And I don't think any game has really sort of captivated that experience that Geist gives you. Don't sleep on this game. I know for a fact that this is a super cheap game. I hope I drive up the price so that none of you can afford it. I'm just kidding. If this video does that, I apologize in advance. But just emulate it anyways. Like, your freaking computer can run GameCube probably just fine. But Geist, great game. I don't care what anyone says. Kiss my ass. I love it. Next up is a game that, I mean, you've definitely played it before, but I think the GameCube version of the game is honestly the best version of the game in terms of becoming as close to the arcade, if not better than the arcade, as humanly possible, and that is Crazy Taxi. Now, Crazy Taxi released on the Dreamcast. I'm not sure if it came out on the PlayStation 2. I'm pretty sure it came out on the Xbox, but I like the GameCube version of the game best because I kind of like the GameCube controller. I know a lot of people don't like it, but this is pretty much Crazy Taxi at its peak with the official soundtrack that, yeah, like, you gotta have that Offspring in there or else it's just not really Crazy Taxi. Of course, Crazy Taxi is a simple game. You're going around picking up would-be fair people and bringing them to a location on the map that they need to go to in a specific amount of time. The quicker you do it, the better bonus you get, the more time bonus you get, the more money you get. It's an arcade game, but I just feel like the GameCube version of the game is super good. It's super enjoyable, and it's really one of the best, if not the best versions of the original Crazy Taxi game. I know there's other Crazy Taxi games out there, but for me and my nostalgia purposes, the first one is still the best one, and I love playing this game on the GameCube. And honestly, it wasn't until like 2 years ago that I knew that there was a GameCube version of the game, so this is a recent play for me when I picked it up, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So you should be like me and pick it up. Now, this game's a freaking banger. This game rules ass, and I loved it back in the day, and I still love it now. Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee. Now, Melee, you know, if you have to Smash Brothers Melee, that's what everyone assimilates with the GameCube. No, you can keep that. Like, Smash Brothers Melee, great game, don't get me wrong. But Godzilla and kaiju creatures are cool. All right, I like Godzilla. I like the different forms of Godzilla, the Mecha Godzilla, this sort of Godzilla, all the different characters, Rodan and Mothra, and all the other characters that are assimilated within the Godzilla universe. And they were like, yo, let's make a Godzilla fighting game where you can like destroy the buildings around you and like you're just a big kaiju creature doing all these attacks. And that's what Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee is. This is a fantastic game. This, in my opinion, is a top 15 game on the GameCube, no matter what we're talking about. We're talking about the best games on the GameCube. I'm putting Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee on there. It's so much fun. It always just feels fresh because of the whole sort of what's going to happen within this level, what's going to happen within this fight that I'm currently fighting in, especially when you're playing against a friend in like local co-op mode, because it's just so much fun. I love all of the big creatures in the game. I still think the game looks phenomenal, especially for the time frame that it came out in. It really hasn't aged all that much. This is yet another game, much like Geist, that I would love to see get an HD remaster. Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee, fantastic game. Do not sleep on it. One of the best games available on the GameCube. Now, this next game I'm not going to talk too much about because I feel like everyone has already talked about it. It's pretty much been on every GameCube hidden gem video that has ever really existed. So here we go. It's Viewtiful Joe. Viewtiful Joe, fantastic game. Henshin a go-go, baby. I loved Viewtiful Joe at that time frame. But you got to remember, the reason why Viewtiful Joe was not a huge success wasn't because the character was kind of weird and, you know, kind of a Japanese-based sort of character, because that stuff is super popular, especially back then. The problem with Viewtiful Joe was it was a 2D game. And at that time, 2D games were not appreciated. Nobody wanted to play new 2D games. With the more powerful hardware that was coming out, we wanted to see the push to these 3D worlds. And 2D games from that time frame are criminally underrated. Ask anyone, they will tell you that. And that is the reason why Viewtiful Joe was not a successful game. Viewtiful Joe is a freaking fantastic game. It's one of the best games on the GameCube. Once again, I would put this on my top 15 GameCube games of all time, regardless about what we're talking about. It's a fun 2D action platformer game. You kind of know what to expect. It's very fast paced. The graphics are absolutely beautiful. The world that they've crafted is interesting and funny and quirky as well. A fantastic game, man. Viewtiful Joe, do not sleep on it. The only reason people slept on it back in the day was simply because it was a 2D game, but you're smarter than that and you could appreciate 2D games now. Bullet hell games are all the rage nowadays, but back in the day, there wasn't really that many, and shoot 'em up games on the GameCube were kind of few and far between. Everyone always talks about Ikaruga. They try to say that that's a hidden gem, and I'm like, who doesn't know about Ikaruga? That's like saying, oh, Skies of Arcadia Legends, that's a hidden gem. No, it's not. It's one of the best games on the system. So when you're looking at shoot 'em up games on the GameCube, the one game that comes to mind is a bullet hell game, because bullet hell games at that time were not nearly as popular as they are now, and that is simply Chaos Field. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say about this game. It's a shoot 'em up game. It's a bullet hell game, but I think it's very fun. It's a very good looking game, and it's a very fast playing game. I remember buying this game on a whim back in the day when I was working at the GameStop, and they were liquidating all the GameCube stuff that we had, because they were kind of trying to do the retro stuff at that time. They've tried to do retro stuff many, many times. This isn't a one-off occurrence. They always, they think it's like a new idea or something, but this game is super fun if you're a fan of shoot 'em up games and bullet hell games. And really, the most important thing is There's not a lot of shoot 'em up games on the GameCube, but if you're looking for a new one to play, definitely check out Chaos Field. I have no idea if it's an expensive one nowadays, but emulate it. I've said emulate these games a million times. I don't want to hear bitching about the prices of these games. Our next game is yet another first-party Nintendo game, and I know your little wheels are turning in your head. You're like, okay, it's gonna be Chibi Robo. No, it's not gonna be Chibi Robo because that game has been overexposed in my opinion. Okay, it's not Chibi Robo. Oh, it's gonna be Star Fox Adventures because everyone hates that game. No, it's not gonna be Star Fox Adventures because I love Star Fox Adventures and I've always talked well about it, and I don't see how a Star Fox Zelda game could really be considered a hidden gem. However, there is one game on the GameCube that is a published first-party Nintendo title, much like Geist, went under the radar, nobody appreciates it. We haven't seen this franchise once again since the Wii, and that's a damn shame because it's Battalion Wars. Take Advance Wars, make it a real-time strategy game where you can control anything on the map. You can control an infantryman, you can control a tank, you can control an airplane, you can control a boat, anything you want. And you actually control it. If you're an infantryman, you're pew 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 shooting the guns. If you're a tank, you're rolling over people and blowing crap up. Battalion Wars is a brilliant game. Battalion Wars should be Nintendo's answer to games like Call of Duty, to games like Battlefield, because this is a unique spin on an Advance Wars formula, which of course is a turn-based strategy game, but this is a real-time strategy game, and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Nobody bought this game on the GameCube. Nobody bought the successor on the Wii, which had freaking online, which just made it so much fun. I don't understand it. I don't understand why nobody cares about Battalion Wars. But you know who cares about Battalion Wars? I do. I care about Battalion Wars. It's a hidden gem because nobody appreciates it, nobody loves it, and I love it. And that's all that matters at the end of the day, because this is my list. But seriously, Battalion Wars is an absolute banger. One day this game will get the appreciation it deserves. We just might have to be the ones to appreciate it. Sonic the Hedgehog is cool. I like Sonic the Hedgehog. I've always enjoyed his games as a child. It was shocking to see Sonic the Hedgehog on Nintendo platforms back in the early 2000s. I mean, you had Sonic games like Sonic Adventure coming out on the GameCube because Sega wasn't making consoles anymore. It was weird, man. It was like, that was like the end of times. Like if you would have said, okay, this is the end of the world, I would have been like, you're completely right, because this is insanity. But Sonic, of course, is a franchise that has had a lot of games, a lot of obscure games, a lot of weird games as well. And there's a compilation on the GameCube that is just mint. It is just mint. And once again, some of these games still have not released on other platforms. This is the best way to play a bunch of obscure ass Sonic the Hedgehog games with the Sonic Gems Collection. The Sonic Gems Collection, a hidden gem. It just goes right hand in hand. Now the list of games is as follows. You have Sonic the Fighters, which was an arcade game that was really cool. Sonic CD, Sonic R, which of course is the infamous racing game on the Sega Saturn. You have Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the Game Gear, Sonic Spinball for the Game Gear, Sonic the Hedgehog Triple Trouble for the Game Gear, Sonic Drift 2 for the Game Gear, Tails Sky Patrol for the Game Gear, and Tails Adventure for the Game Gear. And there's actually unlockable games such as Vector Man, Vector Man 2, Bonanza Brothers, Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3. And there's also unlockable Sega Genesis games in this as well. But for me, just having these Game Gear games and being able to play them on your TV, especially at that time, because there was no way to do something like that, that was just freaking awesome, because some of those Game Gear games are like super underrated and they're super good. Sonic the Fighters is the weirdest freaking fighting game like in the world, but it looks great and it plays great on the GameCube. Sonic R, this is actually an enhanced version of Sonic R that plays a hell of a lot better than the vanilla version does. I love both versions of Sonic R, but if you actually want to experience the game and play the game with better controls, Sonic R on this Sonic Gems collection for the Nintendo GameCube is a must-have. It is a must-have because they fixed the controls. It feels so much better than the original version does, but I still love the original version. But yeah, this is a great compilation. There's another one, the Sonic Mega Collection, that has all your typical Sonic games on here, but I like this one better. We've played all those traditional Sonic games, Sonic 1, 2, and 3. How many friggin' times do I have to play those games again? I do love playing them, but I would like to play something a bit different. And to have games like Sonic R, all of the GameCube releases, and Sonic the Fighters, and of course Sonic CD at that time, that was a huge deal. There's a lot of bonus stuff on this disc as well. Super underrated hidden gem of Sonic Gems Collection. I don't know how expensive it is. I have a copy. I'm looking at it. It's right over there. And I see the Mega Collection too. I have both of them. And the final game on the list consists of a fighting franchise that is honestly one of my favorite games of all time. Tons of childhood nostalgia for it. And no, I'm not talking about Mortal Kombats and stuff like that, because there was a ton of fighting games on the GameCube. But really, this is an action RPG based off of a fighting franchise. And that is, of course, a game called Virtua Quest. A weird sort of action RPG that takes place within the Virtua Fighter universe, kinda, sorta, I don't know. The story in this game isn't all that great, and I'm not even saying that this is necessarily a great game. I don't think it's a great game. I think it's a good game, but it was a game that was critically just panned when it first came out, and I don't think that's necessarily fair, because this was kind of something that was very different than what a lot of other games were doing at that time. The inclusion of Virtua Fighter character cameos in the game I thought was pretty cool. Some of the levels that you go into and actually play on are inspired by Virtua Fighter. You'll probably recognize some of them. I don't know. I don't think this is necessarily a great game, but I think it's definitely a hidden gem, because I don't think it's nearly as bad as reviewers made it out to be during that time frame. There's a lot of good here. There's a lot of questionable stuff as well. But if you're able to look past some of that stuff, I think there's a very solid game here that's definitely worth at least checking out for a few minutes on an emulator, because I don't want you to buy any of these games, because we're not complaining about prices in the comment section. You are going to complain about the quality of the games only, because you're going to play them on an emulator, and Virtua Quest should be the first game that you boot up on an emulator. It's an action RPG set within the Virtua Fighter universe, kind of like Shenmue was when you really think about it. This is kind of like Shenmue if Shenmue didn't happen, because Shenmue was originally supposed to be a game based kind of on Virtua Fighter as well. I don't know. Sega was just weird. They just loved Virtua Fighter back then, but now they can't stand it and they never talk about it. Alrighty, so those are some GameCube hidden gems for you guys to check out. Like I said, I don't know the prices of any of these games. I don't care about the prices of any of these games. Emulate them. Download Dolphin Emulator. Play them on your computer. You can buy handheld devices that can play these games just fine. Your Steam Deck can play these games just fine. Most of them. Some of them. We'll say some of them. Just fine. I don't want to hear any complaints, but I do want to hear your feedback in the comments section down below. Like I said, some of the cliche games, I'm not going to talk about them because I feel like they've been over talked about, or I've just never played them. So let me know some other games in the comments section down below. Let your fellow brethren, woman in the comments section know some games as well. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button, like, comment, and share. Hit the bell notification as well. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.
The Nintendo Wii was a very interesting system. It really brought Nintendo back to the forefront of gaming, but the problem was a lot of people said that the system was for casuals. You had games like Wii Sports and mini game compilations that were super popular on the system, but a lot of people acted like there weren't any actual games on the system. Hardcore games, games for gamers, and that's entirely not true. With over 1,600 games for the Wii, there were tons of great games on there, and just a lot of people didn't play them. A lot of people overlooked them, or a lot of people just didn't care about them. So in this video, I want to spotlight some of those games, because the Wii has a really good library, I feel. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some of my Wii hidden gems. So let's check it out.
So the first game I want to talk about is Obscure to the Aftermath. Now this is a sequel to a PS2 and Xbox game called Obscure. And if you ever watch like a 90s horror movie with teenagers, you pretty much know what to expect with this game. Now this game follows the kids. The original game had the kids in high school. Now this game has the kids in college. And it's a really fun game. It has cheesy voice acting, the story is pretty laughable at times, but it's enjoyable enough to where you will want to play this game if you're a fan of horror games. The real sort of catch to this game is the fact that there's two-player co-op at all times. So if you have a friend or someone you want to play this game with, it's definitely worth checking out. Now originally this was a budget title on the Wii, but you wouldn't really notice that. I think the graphics are really good, the audio is really well done, and it's just a really fun game. It's not a super long game, but if you're a fan of horror games, if you're a fan of local co-op games, Obscure the Aftermath should definitely be on your radar because it's dirt cheap and it's a really fun game. Next up we have Muramasa the Demon Blade, and this is probably one of the best Wii games, period. And I know that's saying a lot because there's a lot of great games on the Wii, but this is definitely one of the best. It's an action game with RPG elements. There are 2 different characters to choose from, and they each have their own sort of play style, which makes, multiple playthroughs a thing that you'll want to check out. And I mean, just look at these graphics. They are some of the best graphics on the Wii, period. Highly stylized. Look at the background, like the blowing grass and stuff. It just looks so gorgeous. And it's just a fun game. If you're a fan of old school hack and slash side-scrolling games, this game definitely needs to be on your radar. Like I said, it's probably one of the best Wii games overall, period. And it's a shame that more people didn't check this game out when it originally released, because it's just a fun game. There's a lot to do, there's a lot to see, and the combos are awesome. The weapon upgrades are awesome. Tons of customization for your character. So if you haven't played Muramasa the Demon Blade, you are honestly missing out on one of the best games of the Wii generation. So make sure you check it out. If you are a longtime viewer of my channel, you know that I love the Wii version of Ghostbusters. Now, essentially, this is the true 3rd movie in the Ghostbusters franchise. It has all of the original voice actors, and the Wii version is just my favorite version because of the motion controls. Yes, the motion controls actually add to a game, and they just feel great with this game. It really feels like you're wrangling in these ghosts, and it's just a fun game top to bottom. There's a lot to do, there's a lot to see, there's indestructible environments, and just the gameplay is just very top notch. I love the presentation in the game. The cartoon environments, can be off-putting. The PS3 and the Xbox 360 versions went with a more realistic graphical style, but I like this cartoon style. I was a big fan of the Ghostbusters cartoon, so this kind of resonates with me. And just the game is very fun. If you're a fan of Ghostbusters, if you're a fan of the movies, this game definitely needs to be on your radar. Even if you've played the PS3 or the Xbox 360 version or the PC version, I think the Wii version is definitely worth checking out just because of the motion controls and these stylized graphics. And it's not a long game, it takes about 6 or 7 hours to beat, but you will have a blast literally the entire time playing it, wrangling in ghosts like Slimer, just destroying property, trying to see what you can and can't do, and just a great game. And like I said, the voice acting is just top notch, really adds to the game, and really adds to the atmosphere of the game. So definitely check out Ghostbusters on the Wii.
The psychonic vibrations seem to be amplifying their energy. Their manifestations are becoming more powerful and dangerous by the second. But don't be afraid, because
Another game I love to death is Silent Hill Shattered Memories. Now, if you've ever played a Silent Hill game, this could be a bit off-putting because there's no combat, there's no weapons, there's none of that. This game is more of a psychological horror game, and it's immensely well done. I really enjoy the Wii version. The motion controls really sort of add to the game, I feel, using the flashlight, navigating these areas, and it's a reimagination of the first game. So if you've played the first game, you'll notice the same lead character and sort of the same lead story, but the way the game plays out is completely different. Being a psychological horror game, the main draw to this game is the different endings. There's so many different endings in the game because the game adapts to the way you play it. So if you look at a sexy poster on the wall, it kind of pegs you as a pervert if you look too long, and so the game changes. There's Q&A questions with the psychiatrist like you saw earlier, and just a really fun game. The lack of combat can be a bit off-putting because this is what you do. You run from the ghosts, you run from these demons in your head. And it's a game that really makes you think. I really enjoyed this game. It's also available on the PSP and the PS2, but once again, I feel the motion controls add to this version of the game, and it makes the Wii version superior in my opinion. So if you're a fan of horror games, definitely check out Silent Hill Shattered Memories. This next game, literally nobody ever talks about, but it's one of my favorite Wii games. That is Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles: The Crystal Barriers. And this isn't a traditional Final Fantasy game. This is more Final Fantasy sort of meets maybe Xenoblade Chronicles or Zelda. There's a lot of action in the game, as you see, and all of the battles are in real time. And it's a really great game. I don't understand why this game got so critically panned. It got really mediocre reviews when it first came out, but I ended up picking it up, and it's an awesome action adventure game. There is a ton of stuff to do, there is a ton of stuff to see, and it has classic Final Fantasy elements like leveling your character up, visiting huge towns, tons of exploration, and just a really good game. It's really fun. There's a lot to do. You could do multiple playthroughs of the game and see a bunch of different stuff each time. Really underrated game, tons of little mini games sprinkled in. If you're a fan of action adventure games and you don't own this game, definitely check out the Crystal Bears because it's a phenomenal game and it could be picked up for pretty cheap.
Ah, Lane! Thank goodness! I need you to help me out with something.
One of my favorite games on the Sega Saturn was Nights into Dreams, and it's a phenomenal game in my opinion, and they actually did a sequel called Knight's Journey of Dreams on the Wii. Now this game, people didn't like it. Mostly because of the motion controls, because they were pretty much tacked on. But here's one thing, you can use a classic controller with this game. And when you use the classic controller with this game, the game is awesome. It feels just like the original Knights did, with better graphics, with more to do, more to see, and it still has that classic Knights feel to it. It's just a fun game with a really good soundtrack. Really impressive visuals, I feel, on the Wii. The color palette is really diverse, and with the 2-character system, there's chances for multiple playthroughs. The original game even had an online thing in it, but of course Wii's online is now offline, so you can't experience that. But if you're a fan of Knights, if you played the original game, you should definitely check out the sequel, Knight's Journey of Dreams. Once again, this game could be acquired for, under $5, so you should definitely check out this game. A lot of fun. Next up is a first-person shooter. Now, the Wii had a lot of first-person shooters, but in my opinion, this was my favorite, and that was the Conduit. Now, the Conduit was a pretty graphically impressive game for the Wii. Definitely it had its own custom engine that was built just for the Wii, and it shows, I feel. The character animations are really well done. All of the environments, while some of them can be bland, I think they're really highly detailed, and the gameplay is just really fun. Using the Wiimote as a controller, as for a first-person shooter game, definitely shows the potential that controller had with this game. The controls were highly customizable. You could customize everything in the game, and it really made for a solid first-person shooter game. Now, this game did have a sequel, but I honestly prefer the original because the original was sort of rooted in reality with a lot of stuff talking about the Anunnaki, the Illuminati, cool stuff like that, and it actually made the story interesting to me, whereas the sequel kind of went off the deep end. They just went into all this crazy stuff, and it has one of the weirdest endings in a video game, period. If you know what I'm talking about, you definitely know what I mean. If not, look up a gameplay of it, or maybe pick up the sequel and play through it, and that ending will just leave you scratching your head. But the Conduit was a phenomenal game when it released. It had a really fun online system as well, and there was just a lot to do with the game. So if you have not picked up the Conduit, I highly suggest you do. Unfortunately, the online multiplayer is, of course, offline, but there's still fun to be had with the single player. Next up is another game that I never see people talk about, and they should, because it's a fun Wii game. It also came out on the PSP, I believe, and that is Tenchu Stealth Assassins. If you are a fan of stealth gameplay, if you're a fan of being a ninja and whatnot, this is a game that should be on your radar. There's a lot to do in the game. There's 2 characters, each with their own storyline, and the stealth gameplay is really fun. The stealth kills look really good, the graphics are solid, and the soundtrack is really well done as well. You can see here, messing up some guards in the hidden mode, boom. I mean, if you like stealth games, it was a really well done game. Not as great as Metal Gear or anything like that, but it definitely was a return to form to Tenchu in my opinion. Tenchu was a huge franchise on the PS1 and one of my favorites, so if you're a fan of stealth games, if you're a fan of action games, there's definitely a lot of fun to be had with Tenchu Stealth Assassins. Once again, it is a super cheap game, so I highly suggest you pick it up. Zack and Wiki is probably one of the most interesting Wii games ever. This was a puzzle game done by Capcom, and it really used the Wii remote well, and a lot of games used the Wii remote but didn't use it well, but Zack and Wiki definitely did. As you can see here, there was a lot to do with the Wiimote. There's a lot of puzzles in this game. The game has amazing voice acting, really stylized visuals, and it's a really great game. This game got tons of great reviews, but unfortunately, like a lot of Wii games, not a lot of Wii owners picked it up because, hey, it wasn't a mini game compilation and it didn't have stupid, silly stuff to do like, you know, Wii Sports or something like that. So a lot of people did not get to experience Zack and Wiki. If you are one of those people and you own a Wii or a Wii U, you need to rectify that situation. Definitely check out Zack and Wiki if you're a fan of puzzle games and highly stylized games, because it does a great job of both. House of the Dead Overkill was a exclusive to the Wii, and this game was just awesome. If you've ever played a House of the Dead game, you know that it is a light gun shooter, and the Wii had a lot of these because of the control system. So you had games like House of the Dead 1 and 2 compilation, and you also had Ghost Squad, Resident Evil, but House of the Dead Overkill was built for the ground up for the Wii, and it's just a really fun game. If you're a fan of cheesy 70s horror movies and whatnot, lots of blood, lots of swearing, lots of violence, House of the Dead Overkill should definitely be on your radar. The lead character is sort of a Samuel L. Jackson style character, and it's a really well done game. It's gory, it's violent, there's a lot of hidden stuff, there's a lot of reason to play through the game again after you beat it. It definitely is on the short side, but once again, this was one of the crowning achievements in my opinion on the Wii, just because it was so different. You weren't getting games like this on the PS3 or the Xbox 360. So if you've never played House of the Dead Overkill, make sure you pick it up, make sure it's on your radar, because it's a really fun game.
And that is just a sampling of some of the Wii's hidden gems. There are a lot more games I could have talked about, but this video would have been entirely too long. So I definitely will be doing a follow-up on this, because I feel there's a lot of other great games on there that I didn't get a chance to talk about. Let me know in the comments section down below if you've played any of these games before, and if you have, what you think of them. Let me know what games I should put on the next edition of this list, and thank you for watching this video. As always, be sure to like this video, check out other videos on the channel, subscribe if you're new here, and of course, if you really like my face, check out my Patreon page. I will catch you guys next time. Later. For those of us growing up in the 90s, the Sega Game Gear was a very iconic handheld system. It did things the Nintendo Game Boy couldn't do. It had a front lit screen, it had a full color display, and it had, well, terrible battery life. But besides that, the Game Gear was sort of a cultural phenomenon. A lot of people were excited about Sega, and of course Sonic the Hedgehog, so people were looking forward to Sega's answer to the Nintendo Game Boy. But when you talk about the Sega Game Gear, it seems like most people talk about the actual system itself instead of the games on the system. Like, sit there and tell me 5 games on the Game Gear that you really enjoyed. Many people can't do that. It's more about the impact that the system itself made. Of course, the Sega Game Gear was a somewhat success. It sold over 10 million units worldwide, but really not many people talk about the actual games. Well, that's where I come in, because today we're doing a hidden gems video. That's right, folks. We are going retro again on this channel. That is something I hear a lot of. Where are the retro videos? When are the retro videos coming back? Well, here is a retro video for you guys. So make sure you guys share this video around, hit that like button, and comment on it so I can see that you guys do want more of these retro style videos from me. So sit back, relax, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into some Sega Game Gear hidden gems. One thing I feel is really unique about the Sega Game Gear is just the fact that most of the games on the system, besides your basic Sonic games, are really hidden gems because nobody ever talks about them. The first game we're going to talk about is Batman Returns. Now, movie tie-in games were very hit or miss in the 1990s, but the Game Gear got a fantastic game with Batman Returns. It was of course based on the hit film starring Michael Keaton, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Danny DeVito, and Batman Returns has you playing as Batman trying to thwart Catwoman and Penguin from running rampant in Gotham City. The game does a fairly good job of emulating the movie, with very familiar locations throughout the film shown in the game. The graphics in the game are stellar for a Game Gear game, with large sprite-based characters and some pretty detailed backgrounds as well. The gameplay in Batman Returns is the real star of the show, though. The game offers multiple branching paths to choose from, with one path being easier than the other, and the other path having a heavy emphasis on platforming. The platforming in the game is done by Batman's grappling hook, which he uses to traverse areas, climb higher, and avoid pitfalls. Combat in the game is pretty standard, with Batman using batarangs to take out his enemies. Rumor has it that this game was originally designed to be a shinobi game, and I definitely think you could see the inspiration in Batman Returns from that. Yuzo Koshiri and Motohiro Kawashima actually did the audio for the game, and they're of course known for games like Shinobi and Streets of Rage. Batman Returns is a super solid game, and if you're looking for a fun platformer, I think Batman Returns will definitely scratch that itch. The next game we're going to talk about is Sonic Drift 2. Now, while Mario Kart was the king of kart racers in the 1990s, and, well, still pretty much is today, Sonic dipped his toes into the kart racing genre, starting out with the Game Gear with Sonic Drift and Sonic Drift 2. Sonic Drift 2 actually ended up being a pretty fun game that people seem to hardly ever talk about. Sonic Drift 2 is a standard Mario Kart clone, and features 7 different racers from the Sonic universe, all with their own unique stats for speed and handling. The game is divided up into different cups, and placing higher will give you more points for your overall ranking. The goal is of course to finish first and win all the cups. When you are racing, there are various items you can pick up, such as a dash to give you a temporary speed boost, or a mine that you can place on the course to take out your opponents. Each character has their own special move as well, and you get this ability when you collect rings on the course, 2 for all of the characters except for Metal Sonic, which requires you to pick up 3 rings. The graphics in the game are super smooth, and there's some nice scrolling effects in the background, and even some nice little weather effects on some levels as well. Although the Game Gear only features 2 buttons, the game still manages to control rather well once you get the hang of it, and there's even local multiplayer when you link up another Game Gear. It's honestly pretty strange for a Sonic game to be on a hidden gems list on a Sega platform, but I think Sonic Drift 2 is a super good kart racer that really showcased the Game Gear strength that nobody ever really talks about. Castlevania games were regulated onto Nintendo platforms until Bloodlines finally arrived on the Genesis in 1994. But if you wanted a Castlevania clone, the Game Gear actually featured a very solid one, with Vampire Master of Darkness, which released in late 1993. Vampire Master of Darkness has you playing as a psychologist named Fernandad Social, who's on a quest to take out Dracula in London. Much like a Castlevania game, you have a main weapon and of course a sub-weapon. Main weapons are your melee weapons and include things like axes and walking canes. You also get sub-weapons that feature limited ammunition, such as bombs, pistols, and boomerangs. Vampire Master of Darkness is another game that has some great presentation and features unique Gothic London style backgrounds, nice character sprites, and some surprisingly good music for the Game Gear. There's even cutscenes that help tell the story of the game in between certain levels as well. The game can be a bit challenging, and the platforming can feel a bit stiff at times, but Vampire Master of Darkness is a must-play for fans of Castlevania games, and it does a really good job of capturing the 2D Gothic platforming vibe. Definitely a hidden gem on the Game Gear, and a game I really recommend picking up. Like many films in the 1990s, such as Batman Returns, Jurassic Park was ripe for the picking when it came to video game adaptations. While many of us played the 16-bit versions of Jurassic Park on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, both which were very unique and different games, there was another version of the game unlike the others on the Game Gear, and it is an absolute gem. Right off the bat, you can see that the presentation level in this game is extremely high, with an awesome animated intro cutscene that might be some of the best visuals that the Game Gear has to offer. When you arrive on Jurassic Park, you can freely choose which level you want to start out in, with 4 main levels featuring a dinosaur breed that you have to take care of. The first part of any level you choose is an on-rail shooter, in which the Jurassic Park Jeep is trying to drive to the location that you choose, and you have to shoot down dinosaurs trying to attack it. The second part and main part of each level is a 2D platformer, in which you have 3 different weapon types at your disposal. A trank gun, which is your main weapon of attack for enemies in front of you, concussion grenades used to shoot above you, and fire grenades which can help you shoot down below. The game is heavy on the action in these main segments, with you having to wipe out waves of dinosaurs taking place in locations inspired by the movie. Everything looks and sounds great, with beautiful animations from the dinosaurs and some solid music in the game as well. The game also features a real and false ending as well, with the true ending of the game being for the brave who can defeat everything in the game without losing a life. A really fun game and quite the looker, Jurassic Park on the Game Gear is definitely a game worth checking out and is really a hidden gem. Tempo Jr. is by far the most rare and expensive game on this list, but I wanted to include it because nobody really remembers Tempo. Tempo, of course, was a game released on the Sega 32X, which you can find all about in the complete Sega 32X guide, which is available on Amazon right now. Go ahead, pick it up. But a sequel was also released for the Sega Game Gear called Tempo Jr. Tempo Jr. is a pretty basic 2D platformer consisting of 5 worlds with 2 stages each, and 2 minigames sprinkled in as well. You're a grasshopper and you kick and stomp and shoot musical notes at your enemy. The game is admittedly pretty easy and was probably designed with a younger audience in mind, but the reason I wanted to mention it on this list is because of the graphics in the game. The game is arguably the best looking game on the Game Gear when it comes to animation and sprite work, and I honestly feel like this could have passed for an early Sega Genesis game. While it's definitely not worth the current asking price on eBay, which is, well, insane to say the least, Tempo Jr. is definitely a game worth checking out via emulation just to see what the Game Gear's full potential was when it came to graphics. Defenders of Oasis might have the worst box art out of every Game Gear game ever. Like, honestly, look at it. It looks like a terrible romance novel or something like that. But the game is arguably one of the best RPGs on the platform that nobody ever talks about. Defenders of Oasis has you playing as a prince of a region named Shanadar, which is currently being attacked by an evil named Araman, who was sealed away years ago but has since returned. Defenders of Oasis is a pretty standard turn-based RPG, in which the prince that you play as ends up being joined by 3 other characters, but the combat system in the game is a bit unique. Everything is based on the speed statistic in terms of who attacks when. So characters with higher speed will get more attacks than those with slower speed, instead of just being on a time system like many JRPGs were from this era. Like I said, Defenders of Oasis is a pretty standard JRPG overall, but it does feature some strong graphics and audio, interesting variety in the backgrounds, and some really well done humor sprinkled into the storyline as well. The game is available on the Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console and is rather cheap, so if you're looking for a solid JRPG experience from the Game Gear that you probably missed out on, Defenders of Oasis is definitely worth checking out. As you are probably well aware of, I am a fan of Garfield. Garfield caught in the act released on the Sega Genesis and the Game Gear, but instead of just being a simple port of the Genesis game, the Game Gear version features a bunch of different levels that were actually exclusive to this version of the game. The premise of the game is simple. Garfield gets sucked into his TV and must escape, and finds himself in levels based on various TV shows he was watching. The game is a pretty standard 2D puzzle platformer, in which you solve light puzzles sprinkled in the levels with the ultimate goal of making it towards the end of the level intact. The level variety in the game is good though, with jungle themes, ice themes, a graveyard, and much more. Enemies are also indicative of the area that you are in as well. Garfield himself looks fantastic and animates very smoothly, and the music is acceptable as well. It's not a real memorable game, and I honestly do prefer the Sega Genesis version, but I do think Garfield Caught in the Act on the Game Gear is worth checking out for platforming fans because, well, I mean, it's a hidden gem. Sonic the Hedgehog was of course huge in the 1990s and saw several games released on the Sega Genesis and Game Gear, but did you know that Tails had his own game as well? And it was a Metroidvania style game? I'm not joking. Tails Adventure was a Game Gear exclusive, and when it released, a lot of critics didn't really like this game because it was very different compared to a traditional Sonic the Hedgehog game. You play this game as Tails, of course, and you move rather slowly compared to the blistering speed of Sonic, and instead of jumping on enemies, you use bombs to take them out. As you play through the game's 12 levels, you will sometimes come to a fork in the road where you can't progress unless you have a certain gadget, and that's where the Metroidvania playstyle comes in. Tails eventually gets a whole slew of gadgets that will help him access areas that he couldn't get to previously, which of course means some backtracking, but it really makes this game extremely unique from the rest of the Sonic series at that time. A lot of the gadgets in the game are really cool, but Tails does have a limited inventory space, so inventory management is key. Tails Adventure features some pretty solid graphics and audio as well, and really is a must-play for those looking for something different from the Sonic universe during this time frame. Who knew Tails was into Metroidvania-style action? So those are some of my Sega Game Gear hidden gems. And like I said, you might have played some of these games, you might not have even heard of some of these games. But when it comes to the Game Gear, I feel like most of the games released for the system were hidden gems, because a lot of people just got a Game Gear and Sonic, and that was pretty much it. So be sure to let me know some of your hidden gems for the Sega Game Gear in the comments section down below. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. Like I said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below letting me know that you enjoyed this so I can make more retro videos in the future. I am planning on doing some more retro stuff in 2020. I kind of slacked off a bit in 2019, but the retro is coming back. But just let me know that you guys are enjoying this. Get those views up nice and high, share the video around, and I'll be making more of these. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Later. Growing up in the 16-bit era, the Sega Genesis was my platform of choice. I actually didn't play the Super Nintendo till I was much older. The Sega Genesis was what I wanted, and thankfully my parents got it for me. So I decided, you know what, I've been on a Sega kick lately. We've been talking about lots of Sega stuff on the channel. It is time to do the Sega Genesis Hidden Gems video. Now, with any Hidden Gems video on this channel, one thing I always keep in mind is price point. I don't like watching a Hidden Gems video and then finding out all of these games are super expensive. I think the most expensive game on this list is only like 30 bucks, so that's definitely very reasonable. So sit back, relax, subscribe, and learn about some Sega Genesis games you might not know about, or maybe just games you passed up. Without any further ado, let's get into my Sega Genesis Hidden Gems.
When you think of the Sega Genesis, you probably don't think of the first-person shooter genre. Surprisingly though, there's actually a really fun one on the Genesis called Zero Tolerance. The story is pretty cliche, aliens, humans that are brainwashed, outer space, but the game really provides a solid first-person shooting experience on the Genesis. With a variety of characters to choose from, and you could select another one to die to keep progressing, the game really offers something unique. The graphics are pretty smooth, and the frame rate is surprisingly decent. The craziest thing about this game though is the ability to link two Genesis consoles together and play two-player co-op. Each player does need a TV and whatnot, but still, it's pretty impressive to see this running on 16-bit hardware. Zero Tolerance is a unique game, and since it's cheap as hell, you probably want to check out this primitive but fun first-person shooter on the Genesis. .3D fighters were becoming huge in the mid-90s with games like Tekken and Battle Arena Toshinden, but my favorite was always Virtua Fighter. As a huge fan of the arcade games, and after lusting the 32X and Saturn games, I remember seeing Virtua Fighter 2 for the Genesis as a kid and being blown away that a 3D fighter could be on the Genesis. I then realized it wasn't the Virtua Fighter I knew, and it was a 2D fighter, and I actually never played it until I was an adult. Virtua Fighter 2 for the Genesis is actually a solid fighter though, if you can look past the fact that it's actually Virtua Fighter 1, but named differently for some reason. The gameplay still feels a lot like Virtua Fighter though, being easy to control but difficult to master. All of the moves are in the game as well, and the animation is pretty solid for the most part. Don't let the fact that they made a 3D fighter into a 2D fighter turn you off though, as Virtua Fighter 2 is cheap but a fun fighter on the Genesis. The 16-bit era had a lot of great platformers, but one game that seems to be overlooked is QuackShot. What happens when you take a film franchise like Indiana Jones and mix it with Donald Duck? Well, you get QuackShot. A lot of the Disney games looked fantastic on the Genesis, and QuackShot is no exception, with great animation, parallax scrolling in the backgrounds, and interesting enemy variety. The game is a puzzle platformer, and while most of the puzzles are pretty easy, it's still a nice deviation of the gameplay. Donald can also eat a bunch of red peppers and become invincible for a short period of time as well. If you're a fan of puzzle platformers or Disney animation games in general, QuackShot is another must-own for the Sega Genesis. Cheeky Cheeky Boys was a game I actually wasn't familiar with until a YouTube friend, Retro Games Vinyl and Beer, suggested I check it out when I was telling him I was doing this video. And honestly, I'm glad I did, as Cheeky Cheeky Boys is a pretty solid platformer for the Sega Genesis. Originally an arcade title, Cheeky Cheeky Boys, or Mega Twins depending on where you live, has you playing as one of two twins who are trying to reclaim their homeland, which has been trashed by monsters. While this version of the game loses the two-player co-op mode of the arcade version, the game is otherwise pretty close to the original source material. The game has a lot of charm and character in the design of it, so if you're looking for a solid platformer with bright and colorful visuals, Cheeky Cheeky Boys is a solid pickup. Alright, this is obviously the most well-known game on the list, but I still feel like people overlooked it because, well, it's not a traditional Sonic game. Sonic Spinball was the first Sonic spin-off game, and as the title suggests, it is a pinball game. Well, the game doesn't really retain any elements from the Sonic games, although you do have to defeat Robotnik, or Eggman as he's called nowadays by the kids, and you do collect rings. Sonic Spinball deviates from the standard pinball titles though, by having huge sprawling levels instead of just a standalone single screen table. One area I really like about Sonic Spinball is the music, with funky tracks that probably should have been in a mainline Sonic game instead of being regulated to a side game. The pinball mechanics are pretty solid, although it can be sometimes a bit frustrating when you need to get to a certain area on the level but can't seem to do it. Considering this game is often under $5, it's definitely worth checking out because honestly, you've probably passed on it a million times. Speaking of Sonic, one genre that I'm surprised never became a thing on the Genesis was Sonic clones. You would think that people would want to cash in on the Sonic craze with the super fast platformer game, but no one ever really did. Well, no one except for Vic Tokai, who released Socket. You play as a time-traveling duck named Socket in a game that clearly is inspired by Sonic the Hedgehog. And by inspired, I mean rips off, but that's not really a bad thing. The levels are broken up into high-speed levels and levels that require more exploration and a slower pace, which is actually pretty interesting. Socket looks pretty decent, and the music sounds like a love letter to Sonic games as well. Socket doesn't do anything really well, but it doesn't do anything really bad either, and considering the price tag is definitely worth checking out if you're a Sonic fan looking for something a little bit different on the Sega Genesis. Shmup games were pretty plentiful on the Genesis, with most commanding a high price tag nowadays, but one that is still very reasonably priced and often overlooked is Biohazard Battle. A side-scrolling shooter, Biohazard Battle has you choosing from one of 4 ships, each with their own unique abilities, and exploring various levels blowing up enemies. The game actually lets you block incoming attacks too, which is a bit different from most shmups where you have to just avoid them. With tons of power-ups on the levels, bright and colorful graphics, and a really bass-heavy soundtrack with some good tunes, Biohazard Battle is a pretty straightforward but fun shmup game. Treasure is often known for their games such as Gunstar Heroes on the Genesis, but an often overlooked game of theirs is Light Crusader. An action RPG that is pretty reminiscent of games like Landstalker, Light Crusader uses that same sort of isometric view. The gameplay is pretty straightforward, buying items and equipment from various locations in towns, and then traversing dungeons that feature puzzles, most of which aren't too hard to solve. The highlight of the game though is by far the graphics, which are some of the best I've seen on the Genesis, with lots of colors and rich detailed backgrounds. The goal of the game is to rescue kidnapped people, and has a pretty good pace in terms of the gameplay progressing throughout the dungeons. The isometric view is a bit confusing at times though, and can result in some cheap hits, but for the most part, Light Crusader is a very enjoyable action RPG that I definitely recommend you check out. One of my favorite cartoons growing up was Garfield and Friends. When it was announced that Garfield was getting his own Genesis game, I was pretty excited as a kid and remember getting Garfield caught in the act for one of my birthdays. The game has you playing as Garfield, who gets sucked into a TV one night after breaking it. The game has you going through themed areas such as a Dracula level or my favorite, one based on Casablanca. Characters from the show such as Odie and John make cameos as characters throughout the game. The animation for Garfield caught in the act though is top notch and arguably has some of the best visuals on the Genesis for a side-scrolling platformer. The game is a bit short with only 6 levels, but it's a blast to play while it lasts. If you're a fan of Garfield or side-scrolling platformers, Caught in the Act is a definite must-own. Mortal Kombat made violent fighters a household staple, but in my opinion the original games don't hold up that well in modern times. One violent fighter that is often overlooked is Weapon Lord though. Weapon Lord is a weapons-based 2D fighter with lots of violence, fatalities, and pretty interesting characters. The gameplay still holds up today as well, with a blocking system that helps you parry your opponent's attacks. Weapon Lord is unique in that it was designed with home consoles in mind and wasn't a simple arcade port like most fighters were at the time. With a good variety of characters and pretty deep gameplay, Weapon Lord is a fantastic fighter that people need to try out. It's sometimes cited as the basis for Soul Calibur, and considering Namco published the game, there's a good chance that this was an inspiration for that awesome fighting series. If you like bloody fighters with great gameplay, pick up Weapon Lord, and you won't be disappointed.
So those are just a handful of Sega Genesis hidden gems. Now I do leave some games off the list because I like to have the potential to do a sequel in the future. So if you feel like I missed something or you didn't know about some of these games and you plan on checking them out, let me know in the comments section down below. And as always, thank you for watching this video. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Check out other videos on the channel. If you really like my face, check out my Patreon page. And if you really feel inclined, send me some friend mail. The P.O. box is in the description box down below. I'll catch you guys next time. Later. The Dreamcast is one of my favorite systems of all time. Released in 1999, the Sega Dreamcast was Sega's last home console, and a lot of people felt that they went out kind of on a weak note. I think they went out on a bang though. There were so many awesome games for this system, and it's a shame that it was just overran by the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 had a DVD player, and DVDs were a hot commodity at the time, so it made a lot more sense for people to pick up a PlayStation 2. Also, the Dreamcast had a traditional Sega botch launch, and of course you could burn the games right onto a CDR and play them on the Dreamcast, so piracy was running rampant on the system. But in actuality, I still love the Dreamcast. I think it's a super underrated console, and there's so many awesome games for it, like Shenmue and Sega GT, Sonic Adventure, that everyone knows about. But there's a lot of hidden gems for the console as well, and so I decided to do another Hidden Gems video. This time we're going to look at hidden gems for the Dreamcast. Let's see what I can find. Street racing of import cars started becoming pretty popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, but no games really replicated that feeling as they were either racing sims or strictly arcade games. Tokyo Extreme Racer was one of the first games to embrace the street racing lifestyle, with a heavy focus on car customization. Instead of racetracks, you would take your car onto the streets of Tokyo and flash your headlights at other cars you wanted to race. It was a unique style of racing game and had some pretty solid graphics. The actual racing was a bit stiff, but the uniqueness of Tokyo Extreme Racer was just undeniable. The original D was an interesting point-and-click adventure style game, and a pseudo-sequel with the same characters was released on the Saturn as Enemy Zero. D2 ditched the point-and-click style and was more of a traditional survival horror game. A plane that your character Laura is on is overtaken by cult-like terrorists and sent crashing into a snowy Canadian wilderness. Laura quickly realizes that something is off as she has to battle some strange creatures. The story is pretty dark and the gameplay is interesting, as when you are in the open, you play in third person, but it switches to first person in interior sections of the game. D2 honestly is one of my favorite Dreamcast games, and although it's a little bit pricey, is a very unique experience only on the Dreamcast. Shadow Man was one of the few M-rated games for the N64,
and was a pretty fun experience that suffered from graphical issues such as frame rate and excessive fog. The Dreamcast version fixes all of those issues, and what you are left with is a true hidden gem. A dark and violent game, Shadow Man really earns its M-rated rating with dark storytelling based on voodoo and other religious themes. With its non-linear gameplay and tons of side quests, along with really good presentation, Shadow Man is a must-own for Dreamcast fans. Trickstyle was a game I didn't really know much about until I picked it up for cheap at my local retro store, and I'm really glad I did because Trickstyle is a really fun racing game. Using the extreme sports craze of the late 90s, Trickstyle has you using hoverboards to race. You choose from a variety of characters, each with strengths and weaknesses, and hit up various futuristic racetracks throughout a variety of worldwide locations. The game plays a bit like a classic Tony Hawk mixed with Wipeout, and still holds up well to this day. Considering how cheap the game is, Trickstyle should be in every Dreamcast owner's library. Death Crimson OX was a late release for the Dreamcast and wasn't very well received by critics, so it went mostly under the radar. A light gun game that plays a lot like House of the Dead, Death Crimson OX is a solid game for Dreamcast owners with a light gun. It has a cheesy story like most of the games did in this genre, but the game's mechanics and gameplay are a blast, no pun intended, while it lasts. You should definitely check out Death Crimson OX. Blue Stinger is a bit of a love it or hate it title, but I always enjoyed the game. A survival horror game with beat 'em up elements, Blue Stinger was unique in that it was one of the first survival horror games to use a traditional behind the back camera instead of a fixed camera angle that the Resident Evil series brought about. Investigating Dinosaur Island, which is under a mysterious dome of energy, you play as either Elliot or Dogs, and must figure out why there are hideous creatures taking over things. Dinosaur Island is fully open to explore, and the game is high on action. While the voice acting and graphics haven't aged with all that much grace, the game is super cheap, and fans of horror or action games should definitely check out Blue Stinger. Toy Commander is one of the most unique games ever and a really fun Dreamcast entry. After a kid named Andy gets some army-themed toys for Christmas and neglects his old toys, the old toys rise against to destroy the new ones, all while taking inside of Andy's house. Sounds a bit like Toy Story, come to think of it. Toy Commander has great variety in controlling of various vehicles, from planes to tanks to race cars, and is really a fun game with a lot of variety. The controls for the different vehicles can be a bit tricky to get used to, but the solid visuals and fun gameplay make Toy Commander a real unique gem in the Dreamcast library. The Dreamcast had a million fighting games on it, and most of them were pretty much awesome. One that is usually overlooked though is Plasma Sword, which is actually a sequel to the PS1 classic fighter Star Gladiator. Capcom was mostly known for 6-button 2D fighters, but Plasma Sword is actually a 4-button 3D fighter. You have 2 melee attacks, a kick button, and a button that allows for dodging and dashes. The gameplay is tight, the graphics are great, and it's just a really fun and complete fighter that not a lot of people talk about. It is a bit pricey, but if you could track down a copy and you love fighting games, Plasma Sword is a definite must-own on the Dreamcast.
So those are some of the hidden gems on the Sega Dreamcast, which is, like I said, an awesome system. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe to my channel. Due to the success of the N64 Hidden Gems video, if this video does well too, I'll continue to do more hidden gems, so let me know what kind of consoles you want to see me do in the future as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Later. Video games come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. You have big blockbuster releases to smaller releases, and as someone who loves to collect video games, I have played a lot of video games over the years, everything from Atari 2600 up until modern consoles. And as someone who's played a lot of video games, there's a lot of video games out there that I feel are just underrated. Games that people don't talk about. Maybe it came out on a weird system. Maybe the game itself was just too weird, or maybe people just weren't expecting this sort of game to come out on a particular system. So in today's video, I have 11 different games across a multitude of various platforms that I want to talk about that I feel are underrated. And I'm going to talk about why I feel these games are underrated as well, why these games aren't still talked about today, and why these games just sort of flew under the radar. So sit back, relax, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and let's talk about 11 underrated games that are worth playing.
Hey, RGT85. Hey, Sean.
Oh my God, it's Stevie Richards! Now, some of the games that we're going to cover in this video are games that I've actually talked about on the channel before. Some of these games are going to be first timers. One game that I have talked about on the channel before is a DS game that I absolutely love. It was absolutely fantastic when it first came out, but it's severely underrated, and that is Fighting Fantasy: The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. Now, this is a very interesting game for fans of older Elder Scrolls games. If you like first-person dungeon crawling games, this game really needs to be in your Nintendo DS collection. You basically start out in a town, you equip different weapons and get different spells, and then you go into this cave and you're trying to get to the top of Firetop Mountain and take out the Warlock, kind of hence the name of the game. But this game was honestly very impressive. You had a very smooth first-person engine in which you would look around and go throughout this caverns and go into different caves and stuff and take out enemies. Now, enemies were 2D sprites, sort of like in Hexen 64 on the Nintendo 64, but still, they were varied. There was a lot of different characters and creatures that you would come across. There was a lot of customization with your character in this game as well, whether you wanted to be a swordsman and take out enemies that way, focus more on magic, or be a blend of different characters. You could really do that in this game. It was pretty challenging, but I really had a lot of fun with this game. So why is this game so severely underrated? Why does nobody ever talk about this game? I can't really pinpoint it, but I do think I have one reason as to why. Now, you gotta remember, this game came out in the mid-2000s, sort of when video game magazines were phasing out. YouTube hadn't really caught on, so there weren't a lot of people reviewing games on YouTube. So really, most of the major publications that were reviewing games were, of course, websites. And IGN did a scathing review on this game, saying it was just absolutely horrible. And I'm not saying that that's the sole reason, but I honestly feel like that did play a major part, because at that time IGN was arguably the biggest video gaming website in the world. They just didn't like this game, and I can't quite pinpoint why, because I think this game is absolutely fantastic. If you're a Nintendo DS owner, it is a bit of a pricey game, but if you love first-person dungeon crawlers, this is a must-own in my opinion. If you're a fan of older Elder Scrolls games, it's one of the most underrated DS games of all time, and a game I absolutely love. The next game I want to talk about is a Dreamcast game that I absolutely love that nobody ever really talks about, and that is D2. Now, D2 is a game that was released by Warp, and if you're not familiar with Warp, they basically did games like D and, of course, Enemy Zero on the Sega Saturn. And I really enjoyed these games, but they were definitely a bit weird for the time frame that they came out in, and D2 really took that weirdness to a whole nother level. Following a plane crash, you find yourself in a cabin, and you're basically trying to survive, figure out what the hell happened, why the plane went down, even though there was some weird shaman dude saying "Shadow the Final Destroyer, Shadow the Final Destroyer" in the back of the plane, which should have been a red flag, but it wasn't. But this game was really unique in how it really sort of blended different genres together. Basically, when you're in the caverns, you're in a first-person perspective, and you're looking around, and you're basically sort of in a point-and-click-like setting. But once you go outside, there's a lot of different stuff to do. You have to hunt animals in order to keep your stamina up. And basically, the way you do this is you move in a third-person perspective and then switch into a first-person perspective. So it was really unique and sort of a blending of different genres. There were survival elements. There, of course, was survival horror elements, as this was a horror game with a pretty sick and twisted plot line. There were big creatures that you had to take out as well. Some really fun boss battles, and it was just a really unique game. And I really feel like it was just too unique for the time. Something like this could probably fly in 2019, and people would be able to appreciate it. But back then, games just sort of followed a more standard technique, I felt. So this game just really flew under a lot of people's radars. It still looks really good. It still plays really good. And if you're a fan of games like survival horror games, it is a must-play in my opinion. One of the finest Dreamcast games and one of my favorite Dreamcast games. If you're a fan of sort of weird survival horror games, definitely give this game a chance because it's a super underrated game. One of the biggest fighting franchises of the 90s was, of course, Mortal Kombat, and Mortal Kombat 2 was arguably one of the best fighting sequels of all time. It took everything from the original game and improved upon it. You had more characters, you had more secret characters, you had more levels to play on, you had more moves, more fatalities. It was just a fantastic evolution of the original Mortal Kombat game, and is still considered by many to be the best version of Mortal Kombat out there, being Mortal Kombat 2. And of course, after the arcade success of the game, it was ported to a multitude of different platforms. Most of us played this game game on the 16-bit system like the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. I myself actually had this game on the Game Boy, and I used to play it in church and like burn people alive with Scorpion because I don't know, I liked playing Mortal Kombat 2. So how could Mortal Kombat 2 be an underrated game though? Everyone knows Mortal Kombat 2. Well, did you know that the best home version of Mortal Kombat 2 during that time era is a game that nobody absolutely talks about, and that is Mortal Kombat 2 on the 32X. Now, of course, this system, like I said, this game was ported to a multitude of systems, but really to get the best arcade experience, you had to play it on the 32X. Sure, the game also released on the Sega Saturn, but there was a major flaw with the Sega Saturn version. Whenever you played as Shang Tsung and you wanted to change to another character, which is what Shang Tsung was known for, the game had to load, and that really took a lot of gamers out of the experience. There was also loading times for a lot of different things as well when you're playing in between rounds, and of course when you're trying to do fatalities. But Mortal Kombat 2 on the 32X was the best home version of this game. The sprites were big, there was additional sound effects not featured in the 16-bit versions of the game. The backgrounds were much more detailed, and you did not have to worry about the loading times of the Sega Saturn version. This is a criminally underrated version of Mortal Kombat 2, and the reason it's underrated is because it came out on the 32X. I was one of the weirdos who had a 32X during its heyday, but most people did not have a 32X. And honestly, that's kind of what's one of the driving forces behind my book, is because there's a lot of great 32X games that people don't talk about. A severely underrated port, the best home port during the 90s for Mortal Kombat 2, and a game that you absolutely must play if you are a hardcore Mortal Kombat fan. The NES, of course, was home to a bunch of different awesome games. You, of course, have games like Contra, Double Dragon, Super Mario Bros. 3, but one of the most underrated NES games of all time has to be Nightshade. Now, Nightshade was a very, very unique game that absolutely blew my mind when I first played it, and is still very impressive today. It's another game that sort of combines different elements and different genres of games, including genres of games that we hadn't really seen at the time. It starts out as a point-and-click adventure game where you're basically trying to figure out how to solve this puzzle and avoid dying. And then once you do that, you basically have a bit of a free roam to yourself. You could search different things, solve different puzzles. It feels kind of like a bit like a Maniac Mansion game. But once you get out of the initial area, you realize this is like an open world game. There's tons of different areas to explore. The graphics look really nice. There's all sorts of liveliness going on within this city. And it's just such a deep game with an interesting narrative of what is going on within this world that it absolutely just sucks you in. It is very challenging, but I feel like this game is severely underrated because once again, like D2, it's sort of a blending of genres that you hadn't really seen, and the initial puzzle can be very tricky, so I feel like a lot of younger gamers and gamers at that time never really got past that initial stage. Without things like game facts and of course walkthroughs, which are readily available nowadays, this game would have been very challenging to play. But Nightshade is an absolutely underrated NES classic. It's honestly one of the finest games on the system, and if you're an NES fan, you'll probably have this in your library, so go ahead and play it. The Sega Genesis has had tons of great platformer games, but one platforming game that gets no respect whatsoever has to be Garfield Caught in the Act. Now, Garfield Caught in the Act was a very important game to me because growing up, I absolutely loved Garfield. I used to watch Garfield and Friends every day. I used to do the dance to the intro song and everything. I absolutely loved Garfield. So when Garfield was getting his own game, I was very, very interested in it. And Garfield Caught in the Act is an absolutely fantastic Sega Genesis game that gets no respect. Garfield Caught in the Act is basically a game where Garfield is sucked into a TV along with Odie, and he must go through different sorts of levels that are basically things like vampire-based levels. There's a Casablanca-based level, a prehistoric-based level, cliche video game levels that you would see in sort of TV shows. But what really makes this game stand out to me is the animation in this game. The animation and graphics in this game are second to none on the Sega Genesis. I feel like there's such great graphical variety in the levels and the character designs and the animations of the characters themselves. It really feels like a cartoon at times, and it's absolutely fantastic. The game is pretty challenging, but I absolutely love it. I feel like this game was a bit underrated because it sort of came out near the tail end of the Sega Genesis's life cycle. A lot of people were looking forward to the upcoming platform, so they sort of slept on this game. But it's an absolutely fantastic game. It's a pretty cheap game to pick up as well, so if you're a fan of 2D platformers and you own a Sega Genesis, Garfield Caught in the Act is a super underrated game that you definitely need to check out. Another great game from the mid-2000s has to be Indigo Prophecy. Now this game actually sold pretty well when it initially came out. A lot of people were excited for it, and it got pretty positive reviews, but since the initial release of the game, nobody seems to talk about it. You never see it pop up, and that's a damn shame, because Indigo Prophecy honestly is a pretty revolutionary game in the world of console video games for a multitude of reasons. Indigo Prophecy was sort of what we've started to become accustomed to with sort of interactive movies with a lot of modern day experiences. Games where you don't really necessarily control the character, but you control what the character does and thinks and how they react to different people. And this game really brought that sort of gameplay into the limelight. It's a supernatural thriller in which people in New York City are becoming possessed by different spirits and then killing people randomly. So you play as a different cast of characters, basically trying to figure out what is going on. And you basically talk to different people, you get different clues, you go into different areas. It's just a very, very unique game. And at the time, like I said, it was well received. A lot of critics seemed to enjoy the game. It sold pretty decently as well. But ever since then, the game never seems to get any sort of respect. It's definitely a mind-bending thriller with multiple areas to go through, multiple branching story paths, and even multiple endings. So it's worth playing the game through a couple different times if you want to get all of the different endings and get a conclusion to the story. It's definitely a gripping narrative if you're a fan of sci-fi stuff, and Indigo Prophecy is an absolutely fantastic game. I want to see more people talk about Indigo Prophecy because just for whatever reason, they don't. I guess because there's better cinematic experiences out there nowadays in the world of video games that the grandfather of these experiences just kind of gets overlooked, but it definitely shouldn't be. The Nintendo Wiimote really lended itself for a lot of different genres where you could do a lot of different things, and motion controls sort of took on. But I feel like one of the best instances of motion controls in the early days of the Wii was the Conduit, a first-person shooter that absolutely was just so much fun to me when I played it back in the day, and it's just a game that once again is very underappreciated. One of the main drawing points of the Conduit was the fact that this was a pretty graphically pleasing looking game. You didn't really see many companies out there really trying to push the Wii, but the Conduit had a lot of impressive effects, it had a lot of impressive environments, and it had a lot of impressive different aliens that you were blasting your way through. It's once again another sci-fi based game where you're going through different real world locations and having to take out different aliens and things like that, and of course companies that are trying to harbor these aliens and keep them from getting at you. It's a really unique game, and one of the things I really enjoyed about the game was that you had full customization over the controls. You could customize everything from the dead zone to how you controlled the character and pretty much everything in between. It also had online gameplay as well that utilized the Nintendo Wii Speak, so you could actually talk to people, and the online, while pretty basic, was actually pretty fun. The Conduit was kind of a bit of a standard experience in terms of storytelling, but if you actually looked for hidden elements within the game, you actually got a deeper narrative that really sort of opened up the world that you were playing in. The game ended up getting a sequel, and while the sequel was still good, I didn't really like how it just sort of went overboard with the over-the-top elements of this game. This game felt a bit more real world to me. The Conduit is one of my favorite first-person shooters of all time, a fantastic Wii game, and just an underrated game because not really many people played first-person shooters on the Wii. But if you own a Wii, it's a very cheap game and a game I definitely recommend picking up. I'm a big fan of pro wrestling, and subsequently, I'm a big fan of pro wrestling games. And one of the most underrated pro wrestling games of all time to me has to be WWE Legends of WrestleMania. Now, this game released on the Xbox 360 and the PS3, but this game was very unique in how the game actually played. At the time, you had games like WWE SmackDown vs. Raw, which was a long-running series that was very popular. It tried to be somewhat realistic in portraying how wrestling worked. But WWE Legends of WrestleMania went in a completely different direction. It played more like the arcade WWE games or WWF games of yesteryear, games like WrestleFest and things like that. Of course, being Legends of WrestleMania, you had a lot of older characters from the 80s and 90s, essentially the heyday of professional wrestling for a lot of people. The gameplay was fast and frantic. The characters themselves were a bit over-exaggerated of how they actually looked, but I really liked it. The graphics were very clean and crisp, and the gameplay, like I said, was very fast. It wasn't like a sort of simulation wrestling game. It definitely played a lot like an arcade wrestling game. One of the cool things you could do in this game game was if you had an imported save file for SmackDown vs. Raw 2009, you could actually bring those characters over into this game. And it really made for some very interesting situations. You had classic wrestlers versus modern wrestlers. There was a story mode as well, which had different video clips of different WrestleMania moments, and it was just really well done. You could actually relive these moments, rewrite these moments as well with different outcomes. Just a very well done wrestling game. The reason I feel that this game flew under the radar was because it was just so based more on action than sort of a simulation. People wanted something a bit more refined. People wanted something a bit more realistic, I feel. But if you're a fan of action-based wrestling games and you like the arcade feel, WWE Legends of WrestleMania is an absolutely fantastic game that nobody ever talks about, and I definitely recommend checking it out. Grand Theft Auto 3 really started to spawn a lot of open world games, and there's been a ton of great open world games over the years, but one of my favorite that definitely flies a bit under the radar has to be Lego City Undercover. Now, this released on a multitude of systems, including the Nintendo Wii U and of course the Nintendo Switch, but Lego City Undercover is a fantastic open world experience that not a lot of people talk about, but I definitely think I know why. Lego City Undercover has you playing as a cop, basically solving different crimes and trying to find out what's going on in the world of Lego City. It's a really open and robust game, and there's a lot of different areas to go to and a lot of different vehicles you can customize. There's customizable vehicles, you can get different costumes and different abilities for your main character, and subsequent versions of the game actually let you play the game with a friend in local split screen mode. The world that you play in is very fun. There's a lot of different areas, there's a lot of different hidden secrets, and although it is a Lego game at its core, which means that you're basically building blocks and smashing things in a lot of the gameplay, it still felt fresh enough to differentiate itself from the other style of Lego games. What I really liked about Lego City Undercover was the writing, though. There was tons of pop culture references and just a lot of funny dialogue and a lot of funny moments within this game. So why is this game so underrated? Because it's a Lego game, and I feel like the kiddie aesthetic of the game really turned a lot of people who played games like Grand Theft Auto and Saints Row and True Crime series off to this style of game. They wanted something more gritty and realistic, and Lego City Undercover was essentially looked at as a Grand Theft Auto for kids, but I don't really think it is a Grand Theft Auto for kids. I think it's a fantastic open world experience that more people need to experience. So if you own a system where Lego City Undercover is available on it, definitely pick up this game. It's pretty cheap nowadays, and you're gonna have a lot of fun with it. In my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, the Xbox One lacks a lot of single-player narrative-driven games, and that's unfortunate because a lot of these games are very popular. And there was a game that actually sold very well on the Xbox One. That was a single-player narrative-driven game that I absolutely loved, but once again, nobody ever really talks about this game, and that is Quantum Break. Now, Quantum Break is done by the team that did Alan Wake on the Xbox 360, which was a fantastic sort of sci-fi horror-based game. But Quantum Break is a bit different. It feels more like a modern television series in which you play as a character named Jack Joyce, who basically must master different abilities and put things in a company called Monarch Solutions that's basically trying to take over the world into perspective and take out these people. It sort of blends real world elements and sci-fi elements into a TV basic presentation where you have actual live actors playing out different scenes in between different narratives of the game. The game is really fast and frantic. There's a lot of different elements going on. There's time travel, time control, of course there's gunplay as well. It's a beautiful looking game, and it's just a really solid game on the Xbox One. So why is this game a bit underrated? Well, although it did sell pretty well on the Xbox One, we have to remember the Xbox One definitely struggled out of the gate. And while things got better with subsequent updates of the system like the Xbox One S and the Xbox One X, really games didn't sell all that great on the Xbox One when they first came out. And Quantum Break was an early game in the Xbox One's life cycle. But that doesn't mean it's a bad game. It's actually one of the best games on the Xbox One, and definitely a game that more people need to experience. If you own an Xbox One, you really owe it to yourself to pick up this game. You can pick it up for super cheap, and if you enjoy single player narrative driven games, you're going to have a lot of fun with this game. The final game I want to talk about was the inspiration for this video. I was going to do a full video dedicated to it, but I felt like, you know what, I want to talk about some other underrated games as well. But this was a GameCube game that came out very early in the GameCube's life cycle. It's looked back on very fondly, but when it initially released, it was not looked at fondly, and that is Luigi's Mansion. Now, Luigi's Mansion was unlike anything we had seen from Nintendo at this time. You basically control Luigi, who's trying to save Mario, who goes to a haunted mansion and disappears. So you have to find Mario, and basically the game gameplay is unlike anything that we had seen within the Mario universe at this time. Instead of platforming and doing things like that, or a Super Mario 64 thing where it's a big open world and you're running and doing platforming and jumping from place to place, you don't do any of that in this game. You have the Poltergust 3000 and you use that to suck up ghosts. And basically, it was just such a weird game, especially coming to us from Nintendo, that a lot of people just did not appreciate this game. People wanted a game like Super Mario 64 at the early life cycle of the Nintendo GameCube. But honestly, this game was probably a better fit for the Nintendo GameCube, as it was super unique. It's still an amazing looking game. There are definite elements of a bit of horror in the game as well. It's not a scary game or anything like that, but it's definitely a bit of a darker game than you usually see from Nintendo. The portrait ghosts are really unique in how they're basically mini puzzles and how you have to solve them in order to basically suck them up into your Poltergust 3000. And there's a lot of replay value in this game as well, just because of the way it really plays out and just how much fun it is. Luigi's Mansion obviously is getting a lot of press right now with Luigi's Mansion 3, but if you've never played Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube, I definitely recommend checking it out. Many reviewers at the time were just not satisfied with this style of game, and that's why this game sort of flies under the radar. They wanted that Super Mario 64 feeling instead of a new unique IP from Nintendo, but I think this was absolutely the right decision. It's one of the most underrated games of all time and definitely a must play. Alright, so those were 11 games that I feel are severely underrated for a multitude of systems. You probably have one of these systems, so go ahead and check out these games. But let me know in the comments section down below if you're familiar with any of these versions of the games. Have you played these games before, and do you feel that they're underrated? And maybe what are some underrated games to you? And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Make sure you guys check out the description box down below as well for various links. If you want to get your hands on the new Big If True shirt, yes, I actually made a Big If True shirt because I don't know, it's just kind of funny. Make sure you guys check out the merchandise link in the description box down below, along with the Facebook and the Twitter page to follow me on there. And as always, I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.